Well, there was one company that stood out above the rest. It was a dynamic young company. It was in the internet space. It was being seen in those days when companies like Yahoo were becoming successful. It was being seen as a company that could make new economic activity and build markets in the high-tech internet area. And the company, you probably heard the name, the company that we created in the Carnegie Mellon University Computer Science Department, 2 professors, the company's name was Lycos. And Lycos was located right next to our university in an old industrial warehouse building. It was attracting our students. It was hiring graduate students. It was bringing in top people from all over the world to move to Pittsburgh. And you know, boy, it looked like we had done it. It looked like all of this effort at economic restructuring and all of our economic development activity had really paid great dividend. Pittsburgh was poised because we had this company, Lycos. It was the center of a catalyst of our cluster. It was poised to generate a high-tech district like that of Silicon Valley or the greater Boston area or the Research Triangle in North Carolina. By this time, I'd been a professor at Carnegie Mellon for 7 years. And in the American university system, in 7 years, you can take what we call a sabbatical leave. You can leave your university for 1 year and go to study anywhere that you choose, as long as they'll have you. And Elizabeth mentioned, I used my sabbatical leave to go to Harvard University to join the faculty of the Kennedy School of Government. I was cross-appointed at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. I worked there in a great center called the Industrial Performance Center. And we put together a group of people from all over the world, from Europe, from Scandinavia, from Asia, and North America. We put together a group of people and a seminar. We wrote a book from the seminar on how do you revitalize older industrial regions. And the core case in this book was the Pittsburgh case, and how Pittsburgh had achieved as an older industrial, steel and heavy industrial center, how it achieved this change and begun to build this high-technology cluster of businesses. And then one day, something happened that changed my life. And it forced me to reconsider what I thought I knew about how towns and communities and nations grow and thrive and develop. It was an early spring morning, a day not unlike today, misty, cool, but not cold. The grass was turning green in Boston. And I drove my car to the Kennedy School, parked in the parking garage, and I walked inside. I got some coffee. It was early in the morning, and I got a copy of the local paper, which in Boston is called the Boston Globe. And I walked up to my office, and I opened the newspaper. And I turned to the business section. And there was a headline that literally screamed out at me, because the headline read, Lycos to move to Boston. And I couldn't believe my eyes. Here was the company that was going to be our savior back home when I then lived in Pittsburgh. Here was the company that we had spent a decade creating the economic policy infrastructure, the development ecosystem that could provide research, industry, university partnership to build. That was the company that was going to help us build a catalytic cluster that was going to transform our community. And it was moving from Pittsburgh to Boston, and I had to know why. So I picked up the telephone and I called the people I knew back at the university in Pittsburgh. I called some people that I knew at the company, Lycos. And I had many, many students still at Carnegie Mellon, and I asked 2 or 3 of them to combine forces and really to conduct a case study of why Lycos was moving from Pittsburgh to Boston. And the answer that came back surprised me. It shocked me. Because when I heard it didn't make sense. It didn't fit with the way that I had viewed economic growth. It didn't fit my paradigm. It didn't fit my mindset. You see, the Boston people, the Boston mayor, wasn't offering Lycos any financial assistance. They weren't offering what you think of as a bribe. They weren't giving them a tax incentive or a fiscal incentive. They weren't building them a new roadway interchange. They weren't helping them to build a new business. There was no money on the table. In Pittsburgh, we had told ourselves that in addition to our economic efforts and our technology efforts, Pittsburgh had spent $2 billion US when the dollar was still worth something, mind you. Spent $2 billion US to build itself a new convention center and 2 new sports arenas, one for the baseball team and one for the American football team. The Boston people were doing none of that. In fact, when I looked at the numbers, if you think about cost of business, if you're an economist, if you're a business analyst, Pittsburgh was much lower cost. The wages were lower. The people were coming from the university looking for a job. The economy was stalled. The tax rate was much lower, less regulated. Boston was a much higher cost environment across every factor. Pittsburgh was much lower cost. That made no sense to me. Why would a company leave its home, its research base, its university, and in a lower cost environment to move and pick up and go to a new location? And the answer that came back from the people at Lycos began to put this in perspective. They said the taxes didn't matter, the business climate didn't matter, didn't care what the mayor was offering. There was only one factor which was causing them to move. They were moving to Boston to get access to what they called a group of talented, innovative, entrepreneurial, skilled people that were already living in the Boston area. And I couldn't get this out of my mind. And I rolled it around in my head. I couldn't sleep at night. I woke up thinking about it. Why? And then it dawned on me. My theory was wrong. Our theory was wrong. The basic theory of economic development was incomplete because what we had believed, what I had written about, what I had taught my students, what everyone who worked in my area thought was true was that if you have high-paying, good jobs, if you can create those high-paying, good jobs, like we did with Lycos, high-paying, high-tech, good jobs, the people will come. Because as we all know, if we study economics, people move to jobs. If you offer good pay and high wages, people will move. But not in the case of Lycos and not in the case of Pittsburgh. Instead of the people moving to the jobs like they were supposed to, the reverse occurred. The jobs were picking up and moving to the people. And I said to myself, holy moly. I actually used a different American phrase than holy moly, but it's sort of like holy moly, English phrase. I said to myself, holy moly, something really strange is happening here that doesn't fit what I think I know. And I couldn't get it out of my head. And I didn't have a lot of research money to study this. So, and it's interesting. You could give a whole talk about that. But when you stumble upon a new idea, it's hard to actually organize research on it because people just kind of want to fund the old idea. Sorry, but I got a group of students together and we began to talk about this. I just began to talk to my students about, well, where do you want to go when you graduate university, and why? And their answers were very different than I thought they would be. Because they weren't just talking about where they could make the most money, they were talking about other things they might like in a community, which in my generation didn't factor into the equation. If the community was beautiful, if it was active, they used the word. A community needed to have energy. They wanted to be around a diverse group of people. All these kinds of answers came back to me. And to be quite frank, they found Pittsburgh lacking in those dimensions. Very few of them wanted to stay there. They wanted to find other places. And I couldn't understand this. And then I began to get a little research money and began to put together a project. We began to conduct more interviews. We did focus groups behind the glass walls. We began to compile statistics. And I still couldn't put it together, and it took me a long time. You know, this was, 1994, 1995. So it took me a long time to start to piece this together. Well, it's been 10 or even more years since then. We wrote now 4 books. Rise of the Creative Class, Flight of the Creative Class, Cities in the Creative Class, and now my new book, Who's Your City?